In the early morning hours of August 13th, 2018, 34-year-old Shanann Watts returned to her home in Frederick, Colorado, after a business trip. It was supposed to be an ordinary homecoming. Instead, it would be the last time anyone outside the house would see her alive. Just hours later, Shanann and her two young daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, seemingly vanished without a trace. Her phone was left behind. Her purse was still inside the house. Her car remained in the garage. Nothing about the scene suggested a mother had willingly walked away from her family. As concern quickly turned into alarm, police launched what appeared to be a desperate search for a missing pregnant woman and her children. Standing at the center of it all was Shanann's husband, Chris Watts. He told investigators he had gone to work that morning and returned to find his family gone. Publicly, he pleaded for their safe return, hoping someone, somewhere, had seen them. But as detectives began piecing together the timeline, small details started raising difficult questions. The evidence inside the home didn't match the story being told. Surveillance footage revealed movements investigators couldn't ignore. And with each passing hour, what began as a missing persons case slowly took on a much darker meaning. The Watts family appeared to have the kind of life many people dream of: a beautiful home, 2 young daughters, another baby on the way, and a future that seemed full of promise. But behind that picture-perfect image were problems few people knew about, and within days, those hidden cracks would become impossible to ignore. At first, investigators believed they were searching for a missing family. Within days, they would realize they were investigating one of the most disturbing family murder cases in modern American history. Before the headlines, before the nationwide media coverage, and before the investigation that would capture millions of people's attention, the Watts family appeared to be living a quiet life in Frederick, Colorado. Chris Watts was 33 years old and worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum. Friends and coworkers often described him as reserved, easygoing, and someone who generally kept to himself. He wasn't known for seeking attention, and by most accounts, he preferred a simple routine centered around work and family. His wife, Shanann Watts, was very different. Outgoing and energetic, she built much of her life around connecting with people. Through social media, she frequently shared moments from everyday family life, from birthdays and holidays to school milestones and family vacations. She also promoted the health and wellness business she worked for, often posting live videos and updates that gave friends and followers a glimpse into their home. Together, Chris and Shanann were raising 2 daughters. Bella, the oldest, was 4 years old and preparing to start kindergarten. 3-year-old Celeste, known to family and friends as Cece, was full of energy and had a playful personality. In the summer of 2018, the family was also preparing to welcome another child. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with a baby boy they planned to name Nico. To many people looking in from the outside, the family seemed busy but optimistic. They had purchased a large home in Frederick, were raising 2 young children, and were preparing for the arrival of a third. Their daily lives, shared through Shanann's videos and photos, reflected ordinary family moments that many people could relate to. But like many families, life wasn't without its challenges. Financial records later showed the couple had experienced significant money problems in the years leading up to 2018. They had previously filed for bankruptcy, and despite working to rebuild their finances, money continued to place pressure on the household. Raising 2 children, preparing for another baby, and maintaining their lifestyle created additional stress that wasn't always visible from the outside. There were also growing strains within the marriage. While Shanann openly shared much of her life with friends and followers, Chris tended to keep his thoughts to himself. Friends later described them as having very different personalities, with Shanann taking the lead in many aspects of family life, while Chris remained quieter and more reserved. Tension also existed between Shanann and Chris's parents. Disagreements within the family had created friction, particularly during the weeks leading up to August 2018. Shanann discussed some of those frustrations with close friends through text messages, making it clear that the relationships had become increasingly difficult. Even so, there was little to suggest that the family was approaching a crisis of national attention. Friends believed Chris and Shanann were simply working through the kinds of challenges many couples face while raising young children. They were expecting another baby, making plans for the future, and trying to move forward together. At least, that's how it appeared. While friends believed the family was preparing for the arrival of another child, events behind closed doors were moving in a very different direction. By the summer of 2018, the Watts family was going through a difficult period, though very few people knew just how much strain had built up behind closed doors. In early August, Shanann traveled to Arizona for a work-related conference with the health and wellness company she represented. Throughout the trip, she remained in regular contact with Chris. Like many couples living apart for a few days, they exchanged text messages, talked about the children, and discussed everyday responsibilities at home. But their conversations also revealed something else. Shanann sensed that Chris had become increasingly distant. Friends she confided in later told investigators that she was worried about the state of their marriage. In text messages, she questioned why he seemed withdrawn and wondered whether something had changed while she was away. She described him as less affectionate than usual and admitted she didn't understand what was happening. Chris, meanwhile, offered little explanation. His responses were often brief, and according to messages later reviewed by investigators, he appeared emotionally detached. The warmth that had once defined many of their conversations seemed to have faded, leaving Shanann searching for answers she couldn't yet find. Around the same time, Chris had begun a relationship with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. The relationship developed during the weeks leading up to Shanann's disappearance, though few people outside their workplace knew about it. Investigators would later determine that the relationship had become increasingly serious, but at the time, Shanann was unaware of the full extent of it. The couple was also continuing to deal with financial pressures that had followed them for years. Although they had worked to recover after filing for bankruptcy, raising 2 young children, expecting another baby, and maintaining household expenses placed ongoing stress on the family. Like many couples facing financial challenges, money had become another source of tension in an already strained relationship. Despite those challenges, Shanann remained hopeful that the marriage could be repaired. In messages to close friends, she spoke openly about wanting to understand what had changed. She even planned a weekend away for the two of them, hoping time together might help them reconnect before the arrival of their son. As the weekend came to an end, Shanann boarded a late-night flight back to Colorado after attending her business trip. She landed in the early hours of August 13 and was driven home by her friend, Nicole Atkinson. According to investigators, Shanann arrived at the house shortly before 2 a.m. For everyone who knew the family, it seemed like another chapter in an ordinary marriage facing ordinary challenges. There were disagreements, uncertainty, and difficult conversations, but nothing that suggested the events about to unfold. Only hours after Shanann returned home, the Watts family would seemingly vanish. After arriving home in the early hours of August 13th, Shanann Watts was expected to keep several appointments later that morning. She was active, organized, and rarely went anywhere without letting someone know. So when she suddenly stopped responding to calls and text messages, the people closest to her noticed almost immediately. One of those people was her friend, Nicole Atkinson. Nicole had driven Shanann home from the airport just a few hours earlier. When she couldn't reach her that morning, she initially assumed Shanann might simply be resting after a long weekend of travel. But as the hours passed, the silence became harder to explain. Repeated phone calls went unanswered. Text messages were never opened. Friends who normally heard from Shanann throughout the day hadn't received a single response. The concern quickly turned into action. Nicole drove to the Watts family home in Frederick to check on her friend. She knocked on the front door several times but got no answer. Looking around the property, she noticed Shanann's vehicle was still parked inside the garage. That immediately struck her as unusual. If Shanann had gone somewhere with Bella and Cece, why would she leave without her car? Unable to make contact, Nicole called Chris Watts, who told her he was at work. He suggested Shanann might have taken the girls to a friend's house, but as more time passed, that explanation seemed increasingly unlikely. Fearing something was seriously wrong, Nicole contacted the Frederick Police Department and requested a welfare check. When officers arrived at the home, they were initially responding to what appeared to be a routine missing persons call. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, no visible struggle, and nothing that immediately pointed to a crime. But inside the house, investigators began noticing details that didn't fit. Shanann's purse was still there. Her cell phone had been left behind. Her keys were inside the home. Medication that Shanann relied on every day hadn't been taken with her. perhaps most importantly, her vehicle remained parked in the garage with the children's car seats still inside. Each discovery, by itself, might have had an innocent explanation. Taken together, they painted a very different picture. Friends told officers this wasn't like Shanann. She wasn't the type of person to disappear without telling someone where she was going, especially while pregnant and caring for two young children. Leaving behind the items she used every day only deepened those concerns. What had started as a simple welfare check was now becoming an active missing persons investigation. Detectives had very few answers, but one thing was already becoming clear. This family hadn't simply vanished without leaving questions behind. As investigators examined the home and worked to establish a timeline, attention slowly shifted toward the one person who claimed not to know what had happened. As officers continued gathering information, Chris Watts returned home from work and began speaking with investigators. He answered questions about the last time he had seen Shanann and the girls, explaining that he had left for work early that morning and believed they were still at the house when he left. Like everyone else involved, Chris said he wanted his family found. As the search expanded, local media arrived outside the Watts home. Standing on the front porch, Chris made a public appeal, asking for Shanann, Bella, and Cece to come home. If somebody has her, just please bring her back. It was the kind of interview many people had seen before during missing persons investigations, a worried husband asking for the safe return of his family. But almost as soon as the interview aired, viewers began sharing their opinions online. Some believed Chris appeared genuinely overwhelmed by the sudden disappearance of his pregnant wife and daughters. Others felt something about his behavior didn't seem to match the seriousness of the situation. Investigators also paid close attention to the interview, though not because television appearances prove guilt. Detectives routinely compare public statements with witness interviews, timelines, and physical evidence to identify inconsistencies. Behavioral analysts who later reviewed the footage pointed to several observations. They noted that Chris appeared unusually calm at times, shifted his weight repeatedly, and frequently rocked back and forth while speaking. Some also remarked that portions of his language sounded detached, including moments where he referred to aspects of his family life in ways they considered unusual for someone whose loved ones were still missing. It's important to note that observations like these are not evidence of a crime. People respond to stress, fear, and trauma in very different ways, and body language alone cannot determine whether someone is telling the truth. Still, the interview became a major talking point. As more people watched the footage, public discussion intensified. Social media filled with theories, questions, and speculation. Many viewers focused on Chris's demeanor, while others urged people not to jump to conclusions before investigators had established the facts. For detectives, however, opinions on television interviews were never going to solve the case. Their focus remained on something far more reliable: the evidence. But investigators weren't relying on television interviews. They were following the evidence. As the search for Shanann and the girls continued, investigators focused on one thing above all else: establishing an accurate timeline. Every phone call, every text message, every security camera, and every witness statement had the potential to answer the same question. What happened on the morning of August 13? One of the first major developments came from a neighbor who owned a home surveillance system. Detectives asked to review the footage, hoping it might show whether Shanann or the girls had left the neighborhood after Chris went to work. Chris was present as officers watched the recording. The video showed his work truck backed into the driveway near the garage during the early morning hours. Investigators watched as Chris made several trips between the house and the truck before eventually driving away for work. By itself, backing a truck into a driveway wasn't unusual. Chris explained that he was loading tools and equipment he would need for his job that day. But investigators weren't looking at a single moment in isolation. They were comparing everything they knew against everything Chris had already told them. The timing of the truck's movements, the length of time it remained in the driveway, the route Chris took that morning, and whether those details aligned with the timeline he had described. As the footage played, detectives also paid attention to Chris himself. Officers later noted that he appeared noticeably uneasy while watching the recording. The neighbor, who knew Chris personally, remarked that his behavior seemed different from what he was accustomed to seeing. Those observations didn't prove a crime had occurred, but they added to the growing list of questions investigators were trying to answer. The surveillance video was only one piece of a much larger investigation. Detectives also began obtaining search warrants and examining digital evidence. They reviewed phone records, text messages, and location data to better understand the family's movements during the days leading up to the disappearance. Investigators interviewed friends, relatives, co-workers, and neighbors, comparing each account against the timeline they were carefully constructing. At the same time, forensic teams continued processing the Watts home. Although there were no obvious signs of forced entry, investigators knew that didn't necessarily mean nothing had happened inside. Many criminal investigations rely on small details that aren't immediately visible, and detectives were careful not to draw conclusions before all of the evidence had been examined. As more information came in, Chris's statements were repeatedly compared with physical evidence, digital records, and witness accounts. Detectives weren't searching for a single contradiction. They were looking for a timeline that made sense. The more they investigated, the more difficult that became. What had begun as a search for a missing pregnant woman and her 2 daughters was gradually changing. Investigators still hoped to find Shanann, Bella, and Cece alive, but the focus of the investigation was shifting. Detectives were no longer asking only where the family had gone. They were beginning to ask whether someone close to them knew far more than they had admitted. Even with growing suspicion, detectives still needed something more. They needed answers that only the evidence, or the person at the center of the investigation, could provide. By August 15th, investigators had spent 2 days searching for Shanann Watts and her daughters. They had interviewed family members, spoken with neighbors, reviewed surveillance footage, and continued building a timeline of the family's final known movements. But despite all of that work, one question remained unanswered. Where were Shanann, Bella, and Cece? As the investigation intensified, Chris Watts voluntarily agreed to return to the Frederick Police Department for another interview. Detectives hoped that by revisiting the timeline and asking more detailed questions, they might uncover information that had been overlooked. As part of that interview, Chris also agreed to take a polygraph examination. Before the test began, investigators explained the process and reminded him that participation was voluntary. The examination focused on straightforward questions about Shan's disappearance and whether he had been truthful about the last time he saw his family. When the examination was complete, the examiner informed Chris that the results indicated deception. It's important to understand what that means. Polygraph examinations measure physiological responses, not deception itself. They are an investigative tool used to guide interviews, but they do not determine guilt and are generally not admissible as evidence in criminal trials. Even so, the results gave detectives a reason to press further. Rather than immediately accusing Chris of murder, investigators confronted him with the inconsistencies they had already identified. They explained that parts of his account didn't align with the evidence they had gathered, and encouraged him to be truthful about what had happened. Chris continued denying any involvement in the disappearance of his family, but detectives noticed something else. As the interview continued, Chris began making small admissions that he had previously withheld. One of the most significant involved his marriage. For the first time, Chris admitted he had been involved in an extramarital relationship with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger. Until then, he had not fully disclosed the affair. Investigators had already begun uncovering evidence of that relationship through phone records and interviews, but hearing Chris acknowledge it provided important context. It established that his marriage had been under far greater strain than he had initially suggested. Still, detectives made it clear that admitting to an affair did not explain the disappearance of a pregnant woman and 2 young children. The questions remained the same. Where were they? And what had happened inside the Watts home after Shanann returned from her business trip? Throughout the interview, investigators continued comparing Chris's answers with the evidence they had collected over the previous 2 days. Every statement was measured against surveillance footage, digital records, witness interviews, and the timeline they had painstakingly assembled. As those comparisons continued, detectives became increasingly convinced that Chris knew far more than he was willing to admit. Rather than raising their voices or rushing to conclusions, investigators relied on a methodical interviewing strategy. They challenged inconsistencies, revisited earlier answers, and gave Chris repeated opportunities to explain the growing gaps in his story. The pressure wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Hour by hour, the investigation narrowed. The evidence, the timeline, and Chris's own statements were no longer pointing investigators in different directions. They were beginning to converge. By the end of the interview, detectives believed they had reached a critical point. They still didn't know exactly what had happened to Shanann, Bella, and Cece, but they believed the person sitting across from them had the answers. What began as a missing persons investigation had become something far more focused. Investigators were no longer trying to determine whether Chris Watts was withholding information. They were trying to determine how much of the truth remained hidden. Then, the case changed forever. After hours of interviews, investigators believed they had reached a turning point. Chris Watts had failed the polygraph examination, admitted to having an affair, and repeatedly offered explanations that detectives believed did not match the evidence they had gathered. Even so, he continued insisting he had no idea where his family was. Detectives knew they needed one thing above all else: the truth. As the interview continued, investigators shifted their approach. Rather than asking the same questions again, they challenged the inconsistencies in Chris's account and encouraged him to explain what had happened inside the house after Shanann returned home. Eventually, Chris asked to speak with his father. Investigators agreed, hoping the conversation might reveal information he had been unwilling to share with detectives. During that private conversation, Chris broke his silence. He claimed that after an emotional argument with Shanann about the future of their marriage, he saw her harming their daughters. Chris then said he reacted by killing Shanann in what he described as a fit of rage. It was the first time he admitted any involvement in his wife's death. But investigators immediately recognized that his account raised serious questions. If his version of events were true, why had he spent the previous 2 days telling police he had no idea where his family was? Why had he appeared on television pleading for their safe return? And why had he concealed what he claimed had happened instead of calling 911? Detectives continued pressing for answers. Chris then revealed where he had taken the bodies. He told investigators they could be found at an Anadarko petroleum oil site where he had worked on the morning of August 13th. Within hours, law enforcement officers responded to the location Chris identified. The search confirmed the tragic outcome investigators had feared. Shanann Watts was found buried in a shallow grave near the worksite. Bella and Celeste were also located on the property. What had begun as an urgent search for a missing pregnant woman and her 2 daughters had now become a confirmed multiple homicide investigation. As forensic teams processed the scene, investigators carefully compared Chris's confession with the physical evidence they recovered. They examined whether his statements matched the condition of the scene, the timeline they had already established, and the evidence collected throughout the investigation. The more they analyzed the case, the less confidence they had in Chris's initial explanation. Prosecutors ultimately concluded that the evidence did not support his claim that Shanann had killed the children. Instead, Chris Watts was charged with the murders of his pregnant wife, Shanann, his daughters Bella and Celeste, and the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy with their unborn son, Nico. With the victims now found, the search that had gripped the nation came to a heartbreaking end. For Shanann's family, friends, and everyone who had hoped for a different outcome, the news was devastating. But although investigators had finally learned where the Watts family was, many questions about what happened inside that home on the morning of August 13 still remained. Those questions would soon move from the interview room to the courtroom. The investigation was over. The legal process was just beginning. In the weeks following his arrest, prosecutors formally charged Chris Watts with multiple counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts. He was also charged in connection with the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy and with tampering with the bodies after the killings. At first, the case appeared destined for a lengthy and highly publicized trial. Given the seriousness of the charges, prosecutors announced they intended to seek the death penalty if the case proceeded to trial. But before that could happen, Negotiations between the prosecution and defense led to a plea agreement. In early November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all of the charges against him. In exchange for those guilty pleas, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. Instead, the case moved directly to sentencing, sparing Shanann's family the uncertainty of a lengthy trial and eliminating the need for them to hear weeks of testimony about the murders. Although the guilty plea brought the criminal case to a close, it did not answer every question surrounding what had happened. During the sentencing hearing, members of Shanann's family spoke directly to the court about the devastating impact of the crimes. They described the loss of a daughter, 2 granddaughters, and an unborn grandson whose lives had been taken in an act they struggled to comprehend. The court also addressed the extraordinary nature of the case. The judge described the murders as among the most serious and heartbreaking crimes to come before the court, noting not only the loss of 4 lives, but also the profound betrayal of trust at the center of the case. Chris Watts received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. For many people, the sentence represented justice under the law, but for Shanann's loved ones, no sentence could restore what had been taken from them. The guilty plea also meant there would be no public trial where every piece of evidence would be presented in court. As a result, some questions about the events of August 13 remained unanswered. For most criminal cases, a guilty plea and life sentence marked the final chapter. For the Chris Watts case, however, the story didn't end there. For many cases, this would have been the end. For Chris Watts, it wasn't. By the time Chris Watts was transferred to a Wisconsin correctional facility, the criminal case against him was over. He had pleaded guilty, received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, and, for many people, the investigation appeared to be finished. But several months later, the case took another unexpected turn. In February 2019, investigators traveled to the prison to speak with Chris once again. The purpose of the interview wasn't to reopen the case. Instead, detectives wanted to better understand what had happened inside the Watts home and to compare Chris's earlier statements with the evidence they had gathered during the investigation. During the interview, Chris provided a significantly different account from the one he had given immediately after his arrest. He admitted that his original claim that Shanann had harmed the children before he killed her was false. Instead, he described a different sequence of events and offered additional details about the morning of August 13. He also spoke about his state of mind, his affair with Nicole Kessinger, and the decisions he said led up to the murders. For investigators, some parts of this revised account aligned more closely with the physical evidence than his original confession. However, that didn't mean every statement could be independently verified. Many of the details Chris described occurred inside the Watts home with no surviving witnesses. As a result, some aspects of his account could not be confirmed through forensic evidence or other independent sources. The interview answered certain questions. It also raised new ones. In the months and years that followed, Chris continued communicating with people outside prison through letters. In some of those letters, he made additional claims about the murders, including statements suggesting that he had thought about killing his family before August 13th. Those claims attracted significant public attention because they appeared to differ from earlier accounts he had given to investigators. Some observers believed the letters represented his most complete admission of what happened. Others questioned their credibility, pointing out that Chris had already changed his story multiple times and had repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to lie during the investigation. Investigators and legal experts generally place the greatest weight on evidence that can be independently verified rather than on statements made after a conviction. While Chris's later interviews and letters provide insight into what he claimed happened, they do not replace the physical evidence, forensic findings, or investigative work that formed the basis of the criminal case. Even today, there is still discussion about whether Chris has ever provided a completely truthful account of the murders. What remains beyond dispute, however, is the outcome of the investigation. Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, and their unborn son Nico lost their lives, and Chris Watts accepted legal responsibility by pleading guilty to their murders. The unanswered questions that remain do not change those established facts. Instead, they highlight one of the most difficult realities investigators sometimes face. A case can be solved in court, yet still leave questions that may never be fully answered. Years later, the Watts case continues to be studied for reasons far beyond the crimes themselves. Years have passed since the Watts family murders, but the case continues to be examined by investigators, criminologists, psychologists, journalists, and millions of people around the world. Part of that attention comes from how quickly the investigation unfolded. What began as a missing persons case was solved within days through a combination of witness statements, surveillance footage, digital evidence, forensic work, and persistent investigative interviewing. The case is often referenced as an example of how multiple forms of evidence can work together to reconstruct a timeline and test the accuracy of a suspect's account. It also demonstrated the importance of those closest to the victims. Had Nicole Atkinson not acted so quickly after realizing Shanann wasn't responding, the investigation may have unfolded very differently. Her decision to request a welfare check ensured that law enforcement became involved within hours, preserving valuable evidence during the earliest stages of the case. Beyond the investigation itself, the case generated worldwide attention because it challenged many people's assumptions. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers described the Watts family as ordinary. From the outside, their lives appeared much like those of countless other young families balancing careers, children, and everyday responsibilities. That contrast between public appearance and private reality became one of the defining aspects of the case. The murders also sparked broader discussions about domestic violence, family annihilators, and the warning signs that may, or may not, be visible before tragedies occur. Experts continue to study the case not because it offers simple answers, but because it demonstrates how complex these investigations can be and how difficult it is to fully understand the motivations behind crimes like these. For Shanann's family, however, the case has never been about public discussion or media attention. It has always been about unimaginable loss. A daughter, two granddaughters, and an unborn grandson whose future was taken before it had the chance to begin. While the legal case ended with Chris Watts serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, the impact of these crimes continues to be felt by those who knew and loved the victims. Today, the Watts case remains one of the most widely discussed criminal investigations in recent American history, not because of speculation or unanswered theories, but because it serves as a reminder of the devastating consequences of domestic violence and the importance of careful, evidence-based investigations. Long after the headlines faded, the names Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico continue to be remembered. And in the end, that is what matters most. When Shanann Watts walked through the front door of her home in the early hours of August 13, 2018, no one could have imagined that within days, her family's disappearance would become one of the most closely followed criminal investigations in recent American history. What began as a search for a missing pregnant woman and her two young daughters quickly became an investigation driven by careful police work, digital evidence, forensic analysis, and the determination to uncover the truth. Piece by piece, investigators reconstructed the timeline, challenged inconsistencies, and ultimately revealed what had happened. The legal case has long since come to an end, but the impact of these crimes continues to be felt. For Shannon's parents, brother, extended family, and everyone who loved Bella and Cece, there is no verdict that can undo the loss they have endured. A prison sentence may provide accountability under the law, but it cannot restore the future that was taken from them. Cases like this are often remembered because of the person responsible, but they should also be remembered for the people whose lives were stolen. Shanann Watts was a daughter, a wife, a friend, and a mother looking forward to welcoming another child into her family. Bella and Cece were two young girls with their entire lives ahead of them. And Nico never had the opportunity to be born into the world his family had been preparing for. Years later, the Watts case continues to be studied because of the investigation, the evidence, and the questions it raised about domestic homicide. But beyond the headlines and documentaries, it remains a story of a family whose future was taken in an unimaginable act of violence. Their names deserve to be remembered, not because of how their lives ended, but because they mattered. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative and respectful, consider subscribing to Midnight Crime Files for more carefully researched true crime investigations that focus on the facts, the victims, and the pursuit of justice.